The heavy door slammed in my face, through the frosty glass. My husband held up his phone, eyes manic with greed. "This $85 million is my way out," he hissed. "You get nothing." At 34, standing in the Denver blizzard with a scratched suitcase, I did not cry. I just smiled at the glowing window, because the fool celebrating up there did not know his blinding arrogance had already cost him everything. Hello to our wonderful audience at Maya Revenge Stories, and thank you for tuning in today. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero budget to keep producing the content you love. If you find today's story compelling, please consider supporting us by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon, where you can access even better, longer, and more detailed true stories featuring multiple voice actors that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can join right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the video description or the pinned comment of this video. Now, let us dive right into today's story, as told by our main character, Chloe Vance. The heavy oak door slammed shut with a concussive thud that seemed to rattle my very bones, instantly locking me out in the middle of a brutal Denver blizzard. I stood on the concrete porch, wearing nothing but a thin cotton sweater and worn denim jeans. I did not even have a winter coat. The freezing wind immediately bit into my skin like microscopic needles, stealing the breath out of my lungs. Through the frosted glass pane of the front door, the silhouette of the man I had called my husband for 8 long years shifted. Julian flicked on the bright porch light. He did not do it to help me see my way down the icy steps. He did it to ensure I could see his face clearly. He pressed his face against the cold glass, his eyes wide and manic with a feral, unhinged joy I had never seen before. In his right hand, he held his smartphone pressed flat against the window. The screen glowed brightly in the dark winter night, displaying a string of matching winning lottery numbers in bold green text. He unlocked the heavy deadbolt, just enough to crack the door open a fraction of an inch, letting his venomous words spill out into the freezing air. "This $85 million is my ticket out. Chloe," Julian hissed, his voice trembling with a cruel, arrogant exhilaration. "This is my reward for enduring your suffocating control all these years. You do not get a single cent of this money. Take your pathetic bag, get off my property, and get out of my life." Before I could even process the cruelty of his words, the door slammed shut once more. The brass deadbolt clicked violently into place. Any normal woman thrown out into a blinding snowstorm by a narcissistic husband might have broken down. They might have pounded their fists against the heavy oak wood, screamed for mercy, begged for a second chance, or collapsed into the freezing slush crying until their lungs burned. I did absolutely none of those things. As the ambient temperature plummeted towards 0 degrees, a strange, absolute silence washed over my racing mind. It was a terrifying serenity, the exact kind of cold, calculated calm that washes over a person when the final piece of a master plan suddenly clicks perfectly into place. I looked down at the battered, scratched suitcase resting by my boots. It contained exactly 3 changes of clothes, my work laptop, and a folder of my personal documents. That was truly all I needed. I wrapped my arms around my shivering torso, gripped the cold plastic handle of my suitcase, and stepped off the porch into the deep, blinding white snow. The small wheels of the luggage dragged heavily against the fresh powder, leaving a long, jagged trench in my wake. The winter storm howled through the frozen branches of the neighborhood trees, biting at my face and turning my fingers completely numb. Yet, I did not look back. I did not cast a single backward glance at the warmly lit house I had paid the mortgage on with my own blood, sweat, and tears over the past 6 years. I did not need to look back. In my mind, the gears were already turning, shifting rapidly from passive defense to a perfectly calculated offense. Up in that master bedroom, Julian was most likely pouring himself a large glass of my expensive scotch, jumping on our bed, and dreaming of private jets and luxury sports cars. He was so completely intoxicated by the blinding allure of $85 million that he failed to realize the ground beneath him had already crumbled away entirely. He thought he had just discarded a heavy burden and walked away a king, but in his desperate, greedy rush to cut me out of his newly acquired fortune, Julian had overlooked one tiny digital breadcrumb. It was a fatal oversight, a monumental blind spot hidden deep within the fine print of his glorious victory. And by the exact time he realized what he had actually done, I would be the one holding the match, ready to watch his entire arrogant world burn down to ashes. As the freezing wind whipped against my numb face, my mind drifted away from the snow-covered streets of Denver and pulled me backward. 8 years ago, the warmth between Julian and me had felt entirely invincible. We were two young dreamers standing at the altar, eyes wide with the promise of a brilliant future. We believed that our love could conquer any obstacle, but the harsh, unforgiving reality of modern American life quickly ground those romantic illusions into fine dust. The heavy burden of our shared existence fell squarely onto my shoulders, every single day. I dragged myself into the towering glass headquarters of ZephyrCorp Solutions, a high-pressure data analytics firm that treated its employees like disposable batteries. I worked a grueling 60 hours a week, navigating a deeply toxic corporate environment filled with backstabbing managers and impossible deadlines. I endured the passive-aggressive emails, the endless spreadsheets, and the soul-crushing fluorescent lights for one simple reason: I had to pay the bills. Between the crushing weight of my 6-figure student loans and the suffocating 30-year mortgage on our home, I simply could not afford the luxury of quitting. Julian had insisted we buy that specific house because it featured a beautiful, natural-lit sunroom that he claimed was absolutely essential for his creative process. Julian was a freelance graphic designer, or at least, that is what his sleek, unnecessarily expensive business cards claimed. In his own mind, he was an unappreciated visionary, a creative genius who was simply too talented and too important to lower himself to a standard 9-to-5 job. The reality was far more pathetic. He bounced from one disastrous startup idea to the next, designing obscure branding packages for companies that never launched and sinking our hard-earned money into software subscriptions he rarely used. As the months turned into years, his supposed ambition curdled into profound laziness. While I was waking up at 5 a.m. to prepare for brutal boardroom presentations, Julian was sleeping until noon, leaving dirty dishes piled in the sink and spending his afternoons playing video games in his sunroom. Whenever the relentless stress finally broke me, Julian knew exactly how to play his role. On the nights I collapsed against the kitchen counter, sobbing quietly into my hands from sheer physical and mental exhaustion, he would suddenly become the perfect, attentive husband. He would wrap his arms around me, stroke my hair, and deploy his favorite psychological weapon. He would look deeply into my eyes and softly say, "Just one more push, and I will take care of you for the rest of your life." It was a brilliant manipulation tactic. He sold me the illusion of a partnership, an imaginary finish line where my sacrifices would finally be rewarded with the peaceful, secure life we had always talked about. He kept me marching forward, blinded by the hope that his big break was just around the corner, but the naked truth was that Julian had absolutely no respect for my sacrifice. My exhaustion was merely an inconvenience to him. The cracks in his facade eventually became impossible to ignore. As his string of failures grew longer, he grew increasingly bitter and paranoid. He started hiding his financial statements, changing his passwords, and intercepting the mail before I could see it. His temper became volatile. He snapped at me over minor inconveniences and began blaming my rigid corporate mindset for his lack of artistic success. The breaking point arrived when I accidentally intercepted a phone call from an aggressive debt collector. Unbeknownst to me, Julian had been secretly taking out massive, high-interest loans from predatory lenders just to fund his lavish lifestyle and maintain the illusion of being a successful entrepreneur. He had dug a financial grave so deep that it threatened to drag both of us down into total bankruptcy. When I confronted him about the hidden debt, there was no apology, there was no remorse. Instead, he screamed at me, gaslighting me into believing that his financial infidelity was somehow my fault because I did not support his dreams enough. It was in that terrifying, screaming moment that the final veil dropped from my eyes. I looked at the man I had married and saw him for exactly what he was. Julian did not love me. He did not view me as a partner, a wife, or even a human being with feelings and limits. To him, I was nothing more than a living automated teller machine and a live-in maid who existed solely to fund his delusions and clean up his messes. Most women would have packed their bags and filed for divorce the very next morning. I wanted to. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run away, but the brutal reality of our finances held me hostage. If I left him then, the legal system would have forced me to split his mountainous, secretly acquired debts, effectively ruining my credit and destroying the career I had literally bled to build at Zephyr Corp. So, I swallowed my tears. I masked my absolute disgust behind a blank expression, and I chose to stay. I became a ghost in my own marriage, playing the role of the quiet, enduring wife while I silently waited in the shadows. I knew that eventually, Julian's reckless greed would create an opening, a singular, perfect moment for me to break free without letting him drag me down to hell with him. I just never expected that my golden opportunity would arrive in the form of a state lottery broadcast. It was late on a Tuesday evening when the suffocating tension in our home finally reached its breaking point. The air inside the house felt remarkably thick, heavy with an unspoken electricity that made the fine hairs on the back of my neck stand up in alarm. I had just finished scrubbing the dinner plates in the quiet kitchen. The only sound echoing through the empty rooms was the rhythmic, hollow ticking of the wall clock and the distant howling of the winter wind outside. As I wiped my hands on a towel and walked down the dim hallway toward the living room, I stopped dead in my tracks. Julian was sitting entirely in the dark. He had not bothered to turn on a single lamp. He was slouched deep into the corner of the large leather armchair, his face completely illuminated by the harsh, pale blue glow of his smartphone screen. I watched him from the shadows of the hallway, instinctively holding my breath. He was sweating profusely. Large droplets of moisture glistened on his forehead despite the bitter chill seeping through the window panes. His thumb hovered over the glowing screen, trembling violently. I could hear him muttering under his breath, a frantic, rhythmic whispering of double-digit numbers that sounded exactly like a desperate, crazed incantation. He was staring directly at a digital lottery application. The National Mega Millions drawing was happening live in that exact moment. I did not move a single muscle. I just watched his face. The announcer's voice leaked out of his tiny phone speaker, calling out the final numbers. Suddenly, Julian stopped breathing. His chest froze completely still. For 10 agonizing seconds, the absolute silence in the living room was deafening. I watched as the color drained from his face, replaced by a ghost-like pallor. Then, a violent tremor shook his entire body. The shock twisted his features, morphing his usual expression of bored resentment into something deeply terrifying. His lips slowly peeled back over his teeth, forming a silent, maniacal smile that stretched far beyond the bounds of normal human joy. It was the feral, unhinged grin of a starving predator that had just cornered its ultimate prey. The jackpot was officially confirmed at $85 million. For a fraction of a second, my heart leaped into my throat. A massive wave of overwhelming relief washed over me. I naively thought that this was it. The universe had finally thrown us a miraculous lifeline. This unimaginable fortune would wipe away his hidden debts, pay off the suffocating mortgage, and erase the financial dread that had poisoned our marriage for nearly a decade. I took an eager step forward out of the shadows, a genuine smile breaking across my tired face. I opened my mouth to congratulate him, to tell him that we were finally going to be okay. "Julian, did we just—" I started to say. He snapped his head toward me with the blinding speed of a striking snake. He slammed the phone against his chest, instantly hiding the screen with both hands. the manic joy vanished from his eyes in a microsecond, replaced by a glare so intensely cold and hostile that it physically stopped me in my tracks. He looked at me not as a wife who had just shared the greatest miracle of their lives, but as a complete stranger. No, it was far worse than a stranger. He looked at me like a parasite, like a sudden, annoying obstacle standing directly between him and his newly acquired empire. He did not say a single word. He did not jump up and embrace me. He just stood up very slowly, keeping the phone tightly pressed against his ribs. His eyes locked onto mine, dead and unblinking, silently warning me not to take another step forward, without breaking eye contact. He reached out and grabbed his heavy leather briefcase from the coffee table. He backed away slowly, slipped into the hallway, and walked straight toward his home office. The door clicked shut. The heavy brass deadbolt slid into place with a loud, metallic thud. I stood completely alone in the dark living room, the crushing weight of his silent, absolute rejection pressing down heavily on my chest. Within the span of exactly 24 hours, the man I married vanished completely. The pathetic, lazy freeloader who used to sleep until noon was suddenly replaced by an arrogant, dictatorial king strutting through the halls of a house he did not even pay for. The transformation was nauseating to witness. When he finally emerged from his locked office the next morning, he was dressed in his most expensive designer suit. He did not look at me. He looked right through me. He began barking orders, criticizing the way I made his coffee, and complaining loudly about the state of the house. As the day wore on, his newfound God complex swelled to monstrous proportions. He paced around the kitchen island, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon, and started dropping heavy, calculated hints. He talked loudly about how his grand vision for the future was simply too important to be tied down by dead weight. He spoke at length about how highly successful people eventually outgrow their current surroundings, and how true greatness requires shedding the useless anchors of the past. He stopped pacing, leaned over the marble counter, looked me dead in the eyes, and sneered. Maybe it is time we start thinking about freeing each other. Chloe, I have massive places to be, and you clearly belong exactly where you are. He was practically salivating at the thought of cutting me loose, completely blinded by the $85 million sitting in a digital wallet he foolishly thought was his alone. The storm had fully gathered, and Julian was eagerly preparing to strike the match, unaware that he was standing shoulder-deep in gasoline. The very next afternoon, the illusion of our domestic life was shattered permanently. A sleek black town car pulled into our snow-covered driveway, its engine humming quietly against the biting cold. Julian walked through the front door, but he was not alone. Trailing closely behind him was Arthur Sterling. Anyone who worked in the corporate districts of Denver knew exactly who Sterling was. He was a notorious, predatory divorce attorney who specialized in utterly destroying spouses for wealthy, vindictive clients. He was a man who wore expensive, custom-tailored suits and smelled faintly of peppermint and pure malice. Sterling did not bother taking off his expensive wool overcoat. He marched directly into my dining room, dropped a thick, leather-bound briefcase onto the mahogany table, and sat down. Julian took the seat next to him. My husband did not look like a man whose marriage was ending. He looked like a conqueror. He radiated a smug, arrogant confidence that made the bile rise in the back of my throat. I stood near the archway of the kitchen, crossing my arms defensively as Sterling snapped his briefcase open and withdrew a towering stack of freshly printed legal documents. "Sit down." "Chloe," Julian commanded. It was not a request. It was the sharp, cracking tone of a master speaking to a disobedient dog. I walked over and took the seat opposite them. Sterling slid the thick stack of papers across the polished wood. It was titled, "A Clean Break Agreement." It had been drafted with terrifying, aggressive speed over the last 18 hours. Sterling folded his manicured hands, looked at me with dead, shark-like eyes, and began laying out their brutal ultimatum. "Your husband is offering you a highly generous exit strategy," Sterling began. his voice smooth and dripping with condescension. "However, if you choose to be difficult, if you decide to drag this separation into a standard court proceeding, we are prepared to make your life exceptionally painful." Sterling opened a secondary folder and fanned out a dozen financial statements. They were records of the massive, high-interest business loans and shady credit lines Julian had secretly opened over the past few years. Sterling made it violently clear that Julian had purposefully structured this debt. If I fought the divorce, Sterling promised to legally tie every single penny of those hundreds of thousands of dollars directly to my name. They would drag me into a brutal, drawn-out bankruptcy court. But they did not stop there. Sterling leaned forward, lowering his voice into a menacing whisper. He threatened to subpoena the executive board at ZephyrCorp Solutions. He promised to drag my toxic, unforgiving bosses into a messy public legal battle, virtually guaranteeing that I would be fired, my professional reputation completely destroyed, and my only source of income eradicated. They were cornering me. They were using my deepest fears, losing my hard-earned career, and drowning in Julian's manufactured debt as a weapon to force my hand. "Now for the alternative," Sterling continued, tapping a gold pen against the clean break agreement. "If you sign this document right now, Julian takes all of his business debts and walks away entirely. He is willing to surrender all claims and equity rights to this house." Julian scoffed quietly, rolling his eyes as if the heavily mortgaged property was a disgusting burden he was thrilled to dump on me. Sterling flipped to the third page, highlighting a specific paragraph. "Furthermore, Julian legally relinquishes any and all rights to all bank accounts, physical properties, and digital assets currently registered under your legal identity. He wants a clean slate. In exchange, you will surrender any claim to his personal property, his future business endeavors, and any future income he acquires from this exact date forward. No alimony, no shared assets, complete separation." They were framing this as a mercy killing. To any outside observer, it looked like Julian was throwing me a lifeline, sacrificing the house and my personal accounts just to escape the marriage quickly. But I knew exactly what was fueling this sudden rush. He was terrified of sharing his new $85 million reality. I asked for 10 minutes to review the document in private with my own legal counsel. Julian rolled his eyes again but waved his hand dismissively. I took the heavy paperwork into the kitchen, locked the door, and dialed Elias. Elias was a sharp, aggressive corporate lawyer I had trusted since my early days at the firm. I quickly read him the exact stipulations over the phone. Elias was absolutely furious. His voice practically shook the speaker of my phone. He warned me that this was a classic, heavy-handed legal trap designed to hide major, newly acquired assets right before filing for divorce. He begged me to fight back. He insisted that if we stalled, we could force a forensic audit on Julian and uncover exactly what massive windfall he was trying to conceal. Elias was right, of course, but Elias did not have the full picture. I knew exactly what Julian was hiding, and I knew that I needed this specific document signed just as desperately as Julian did. So, I put on the performance of a lifetime. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I let out a loud, pathetic sob, ensuring the sound carried through the thin kitchen walls directly to the dining room where Julian was waiting. I cried into the phone, telling Elias that I was simply too exhausted, too mentally broken, and too utterly terrified of losing my job to fight this monster anymore. I told him I was giving up. I hung up the phone, letting the heavy silence settle in the kitchen. I wiped my dry eyes, perfectly embodying the role of the defeated, battered wife who had finally been crushed into submission. I unlocked the kitchen door and walked slowly back to the dining room. I kept my head bowed in fake submission, letting my shoulders slump heavily. My hands shook deliberately as I picked up the heavy gold pen Sterling had left on the table. Julian was practically vibrating with euphoric excitement. He was leaning so far forward over the table that he was almost out of his chair. His greedy eyes darted obsessively between my face and the signature line. "Just sign it, Chloe," Julian whispered, his voice cracking with desperate anticipation. "Sign it and it all goes away." I pressed the tip of the pen to the thick paper. Slowly, deliberately, I signed my full legal name on the bottom line. The very second the ink dried, Julian reached across the table and violently snatched the document away from me. He stared at my signature for a brief moment before bursting into a loud, echoing fit of hysterical laughter. It was a horrifying sound. It was the terrifying, unhinged cackle of pure, unadulterated greed and cruelty. He looked at me with absolute, unfiltered disgust. "You are so pathetic," Julian spat, clutching the contract to his chest like a shield. "I am finally free. Pack your trash and get out of my house." He did not give me a week to find an apartment. He did not give me a day to pack my clothes. He gave me exactly 5 minutes to grab my scratched suitcase. He marched me to the front door, shouting insults the entire way, and shoved me forcefully out into the freezing night, firmly believing he had just discarded his dead weight and legally secured his massive empire. But as the heavy oak door slammed shut behind me and the freezing Denver wind hit my face, the pathetic, broken mask I had worn all afternoon melted away instantly. Standing alone in the dark, freezing snow, I did not cry. My eyes narrowed, flashing with the cold, razor-sharp focus of a predator who had just successfully lured its arrogant prey directly into a lethal steel trap. To understand the sheer magnitude of Julian's fatal oversight, you have to look past the blinding glare of the $85 million and examine the dirty, hidden reality of his financial existence. Julian was a man drowning in a deeply toxic ocean of unpaid debts. He had ignored the government for so long that the Internal Revenue Service finally stepped in and brought the heavy hammer of justice down on his head. The government placed a massive federal tax lien on his name, completely freezing his personal bank accounts and blacklisting him from opening any new financial lines. He was legally prohibited from using any standard financial applications or digital banking platforms. He could not even order a cheap cup of coffee on his phone without the transaction being instantly flagged and blocked by federal authorities. But a man with a desperate, underlying gambling addiction will always find a creative way to feed his habit. Julian needed to purchase his daily lottery tickets, but he possessed no valid digital financial identity to do so. So, he resorted to the absolute easiest crime available to a man in a failing marriage: identity theft. He quietly dug through my locked filing cabinet, memorized my 9-digit Social Security number, and used my immaculate credit profile to bypass the State Lottery Commission's strict security protocols. However, he did not just use a standard public application. He needed a highly secure funding source, so he routed his secret registration through the exclusive employee benefits portal provided by my employer, Zephyr Corp Solutions. That was his first catastrophic mistake. Zephyr Corp utilized a highly encrypted, federally regulated financial gateway for all its employee-linked applications. The digital lottery system tied to that specific gateway operated under incredibly strict federal anti-money laundering regulations. The terms and conditions were ironclad and legally absolute. A digital ticket, and any subsequent cash winnings derived from it, constituted non-transferable property. It belonged 100% to the verified legal identity of the registered account holder. Julian had manually punched in the numbers on his phone. He had paid for the ticket using a hidden, prepaid credit card, but the digital account holding that golden ticket was officially, legally, and permanently registered under the name Chloe Vance. Now, let us revisit that tense, dramatic scene in my dining room with the ruthless corporate lawyer, in his blind, frantic rush to secure his newfound empire. Julian was terrified that I would claim half of his lottery winnings in a standard divorce settlement. He desperately needed a legal firewall to cut me off entirely before he walked into the lottery headquarters to claim the massive prize. That is exactly why Arthur Sterling drafted the clean break agreement with such aggressive, predatory speed. Julian thought he was an absolute genius. He thought he was using his manufactured business debts as a loaded weapon to force me into surrendering my marital rights. But his monumental arrogance completely blinded him to the actual language of his own weapon. Let us recall the specific clause Arthur Sterling had read aloud with such a smug, condescending smile. Julian legally relinquishes any and all rights to all bank accounts, physical properties, and digital assets currently registered under your legal identity. In his desperate attempt to dump his crushing financial debt onto my shoulders and aggressively protect his hidden jackpot, Julian failed to realize where the jackpot actually lived. The $85 million digital lottery ticket was, by strict federal definition, a digital asset registered under my legal identity. By hiring a ruthless shark of a lawyer, threatening to completely destroy my career, and legally forcing me to sign that airtight document, Julian had effectively trapped himself in a prison of his own making, with his own signature, proudly witnessed and officially notarized by his own legal counsel. Julian had voluntarily, formally, and permanently surrendered his entire legal claim to the winning ticket. He had just handed me the absolute keys to the kingdom on a silver platter, all while laughing directly in my face and kicking me out into the freezing snow. He confidently gripped his smartphone, firmly believing he was the sole master of his destiny. He had absolutely no idea that the digital payout identification code was biologically and legally locked to the very wife he had just so cruelly discarded. The most beautiful part of this entire sequence of events is that I was never a clueless victim. I knew exactly what he was doing long before Arthur Sterling ever stepped foot in my house. I am a senior data analyst. I monitor digital anomalies for a living. 3 days prior to the drawing, I received a tiny automated security notification on my private banking application. It flagged a microtransaction linking my Zephyr Corp employee portal directly to the state lottery database. I knew immediately that Julian had stolen my identity to bypass his federal banking ban. When I stood in the dark hallway that Tuesday night and watched his face contort into that feral, greedy smile, the final puzzle pieces locked perfectly into place. I knew he had won the grand prize, and I knew exactly whose name was legally attached to that victory. The trembling hands, the pathetic tears, the desperate phone call to my lawyer, the entire act of the broken, defeated wife at the dining room table. It was all a carefully orchestrated performance. It was a meticulously crafted stage play designed to feed his massive ego and guide his greedy hand directly toward the pen. I needed him to sign that specific document with absolute confidence, and like a predictable, arrogant fool, he played his part perfectly. The morning after he threw me out into the freezing storm, Julian marched through the heavy glass doors of the state lottery headquarters. He walked with the arrogant swagger of a conquering king, entirely skipping the standard waiting line to slam his smartphone down onto the main reception counter. He demanded his payout, a smug, invincible smirk plastered across his face, but his grand victory lap came to a violent, humiliating halt exactly 3 minutes later. When the senior validation officer scanned the digital barcode on his screen, a blaring red security alert flashed across the company monitors. The officer politely asked Julian for his state identification. The moment Julian handed over his driver's license, the corporate legal team descended upon the lobby. The names did not match. The system clearly showed the ticket belonged exclusively to Chloe Vance. Julian threw a massive, screaming tantrum, completely losing his mind right there in the lobby, until armed security guards forcefully dragged him out of the building and tossed him onto the sidewalk. The fallout was swift and incredibly violent, realizing the colossal, life-ruining mistake he had made. Julian scrambled to hire a team of aggressive civil litigators. He desperately dragged me into court, filing an emergency motion to completely void the divorce settlement he had literally forced me to sign. He screamed to the judge that I had maliciously defrauded him, loudly demanding exactly half of the $85 million. Sitting in that polished courtroom, Julian looked absolutely pathetic. He was sweating profusely, furiously gnawing on his fingernails, his arrogant god complex entirely replaced by raw, frantic desperation. Beside me sat Elias, my fiercely loyal attorney, who was practically vibrating with eager anticipation. When it was our turn to present our defense, Elias did not call a dozen character witnesses. He did not deliver a long, impassioned speech about morality or marital betrayal. He simply stood up, walked over to the judge's towering bench, and submitted exactly one piece of evidence. It was the original, fully notarized copy of the clean break agreement. Elias calmly directed the judge to the exact clause Julian and Arthur Sterling had so proudly weaponized against me. Elias reminded the court that Julian had aggressively forced me to sign away my rights to his manufactured business debt, and in exchange, Julian had permanently, legally surrendered all claims to any digital assets registered under my identity. The winning digital lottery ticket was legally mine, purchased under my exact Social Security number, and Julian had legally waived every single right to it of his own free will, with his own legal counsel present as a witness. Julian's new lawyers jumped up, desperately shouting objections, but they had absolutely no legal ground to stand on. The courtroom fell completely silent as the judge read over the highlighted paragraph. The older man looked down at Julian with a mixture of deep pity and absolute disgust. "You cannot weaponize a legal contract to ruin your wife, Mr. Vance, and then cry foul when the very same document works against your favor," the judge stated coldly. He raised his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down with a thunderous crack. "Case dismissed with prejudice." In that exact moment, every ounce of air left Julian's lungs. He physically collapsed forward over the defense table. His face turned a sickly, translucent shade of white. A horrible, strangled gasp escaped his throat as his mind finally shattered under the crushing realization that his own ruthless greed had just locked him out of his massive fortune forever. 6 months have passed since that glorious swing of the gavel. I am currently sitting on the wide, sun-drenched patio of my private vacation villa in Sedona, Arizona. The breathtaking red rock formations stretch out endlessly before me, glowing brilliantly under the warm desert sky. I successfully claimed the entire $85 million. I did not buy a massive fleet of sports cars or designer clothes. Instead, I secured my total, permanent freedom. I quit my miserable job at Zephyr Corp and used a massive portion of the funds to establish a venture capital firm exclusively dedicated to helping young women achieve complete financial independence. As for my former husband, his attempt to steal my identity did not just cost him the ultimate jackpot. It triggered a massive federal audit. The Internal Revenue Service officially indicted him for severe identity fraud and felony tax evasion. Today, the man who firmly believed he was destined to be a multimillionaire is currently working 80 grueling hours a week, sweeping dirty floors and pumping fuel at a dilapidated highway gas station just to pay off his mounting legal restitution. He will spend the rest of his miserable life trapped in that manufactured debt, forever haunted by the memory of the $85 million he literally threw out the front door into the freezing snow, right alongside the only woman who ever truly loved him. Thank you so much to everyone for listening to my story today. Where in the world are you tuning in from? Please let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want to help our channel survive, please consider joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon. There, you can listen to our absolute best, most exclusive true stories that are simply too intense to make public on YouTube. You can join right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the video description or the pinned comment. Thank you again, and take care.